Great to have you all here. Um, and I'm filling in, so you may not recognize me, but I work at Creative Commons. My name is Jocelyn Miara. I'm the Community and Licensing Program Manager here. I'm just helping out with the CERT today, since my colleagues are both out of the office, and so I'm excited to hear this presentation and to learn more as well. I am here to introduce our presenter, Sally Al-Haq. Sally is a co-lead at Whose Knowledge and works in Liberatory Archives and Memory based in Cairo, Egypt. Really excited to have them here today.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you. Should we start with the presentation or do we wait for 1 month? Yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah.
wonderful. Let me share my screen. Yeah. So I do work in at Whose Knowledge on laboratory work around community archives, and we will get a bit to be more introduced. What does it mean to have a laboratory approach to memory work, specifically in archives? But the presentation I have prepared for you today is an invitation for you to think about access from a nuanced approach on how access is not always a simple story. And I will be using museums as an example, and from that we will flow into understanding access from nuanced approach and also representation, and hopefully get to discuss a bit and imagine certain solutions and approaches to what does access mean and to whom. So as probably all of you know that museums and lots of like heritage sites have been doing a lot of efforts around digitization and making their work accessible. And here I'm using an example of like Rijksmuseums in from Amsterdam, and specifically because they have digitized like a very interesting number of their works of art, which is great. But I want you to, I want us all to imagine different layers when we think of access. And as digitalization is always a good solution, or it can be tricky sometimes. But before we respond to this question, I want to share with you some experiences at multiple spaces of museums. Here I'm using specifically highlighting the Met Museum. And this is like a testimony of a Cambodian artist and dancer talking about their experience dancing and praying to their gods at the Met Museum after actually being hired by the Met to like do a performance. But basically the artist here highlights what does it mean when like the museum in itself as an institute, as a colonial entity, doesn't understand what does it mean to dance to gods, and basically that resulted into an interruption and a cancellation of the performance while the artist is practicing their dancing to their gods. And this is why I have titled this slide as Complex Realities Within Museums. Following that, I'm here also using another experience of an Egyptian scholar at the Met Museum. And I'm specifically also interested in this part because, like me myself, I am an Egyptian and I relate a lot to a big part of what is being represented here in this testimony. And it's basically like if any of you has been to the Met, you probably like are very much aware of how big and how interesting that their Egyptian collection of artifacts, and even like to the extent of having a temple, an Egyptian temple from at the Met. Um, this testimony specifically is interesting because it highlights and it sheds light on what does it mean to be perceived as the other, to be labeled as the other. And this scholar, he specifically like talks about his experience being part of like a tour, a guided tour at the museum, where like all the stories and all the narration around the artifacts and this history was spoken of as like black magic, not as a creative artistic production of a specific civilization in Egypt among many other civilizations. And then he reflects on when basically you misrepresent some sort of like a community or like a heritage in ways that like make it seem magical and out of this world. It results into you being the other. It results into you being mystical creature more than actually being perceived as a qualified creative, a qualified basically like heritage that has resulted into multiple civilization that we have witnessed in our world. And while like shedding light on all of that, I am inviting you to think about like when access stops being like a simple story, when digitization is no longer about just making having a certain painting available. Basically, like what does it mean to think of digitization when the colonial aspect of access is being implemented, when you are making accessible some sort of colonial representations of certain stories. And that's when, in a way or another, we can see that basically like digitalization cannot be a simple answer to decades of colonial power. This is like, for me, like a very funny and a specific example of it basically says like this is like a screenshot of like an Instagram post of Kim Kardashian being part at the Met Gala in 2018. And she has posted this photo of herself like next to a tomb of like an Egyptian like King Neg Amer. And basically, this photo, it has opened like a huge back then like scandal of highlighting that this like was looted from Egypt, and it has been a mystery for years that Egypt hasn't been finding this artifact. And basically, like that was one of the social media posts that like brought so much attention that this finally solves the mystery of where had this tomb been and how it has been stolen from Egypt. And I think here like, there is a layer of what does it mean to think also of access when the artifacts are looted. Well, like the responsible entities make accessible what has been in a way or another not actually theirs. And that also like forces us to ask questions: whom decides and whom defines access, and whom decides what can be accessible or not. moving a bit away from the example of museums, here I'm highlighting an example of cultural genocide, specifically in relation to what has been happening in Gaza since the 7th of October. And basically that, what does it mean to think of cultural genocide in relation to a certain specific culture and heritage in times of genocide? And that basically like what has been happening in Gaza, that it has been like direct targeting of archives and libraries, and also artists and scholars and academics. And with this example here also, that shifts our thinking a bit of like collective memory of what is being in a way erased at the moment at this present moment of history, and that invites us also to think about how the history of today can be represented in the future, specifically with the damage that have been happening. Here I am compiling a few questions for all of you to ask yourselves these questions while thinking of access. I know that this is part of a bigger program for you where you have been learning about copyrights, about digitization, about representation. And given the complex realities that we live in, when the story is no longer simple, I want you to ask yourselves, like, who gets to define access and who gets to take your access away? Specifically, if we're thinking of the internet as a space, accessible by whom and to whom and under which conditions? How are the decision-making processes designed? While thinking of designing those like decision-making processes, are indigenous people involved, are local communities involved, for example, at the myth of how an artifact can be shown and also accessible if digital, in the case of digitization. Shifting a bit away from access as like a right to be granted, to be given, I want us to think of access as a practice. How do you yourselves define access, and how do you produce work in an accessible way? So as all of you like have been getting involved with Creative Commons has been like a response to like what has been outdated in relation to copyrights. So that invites us also to be more thoughtful when we think of the work and content that we produce. And here I'm going to make it a bit more as a reflection on my own work as well. As I mentioned earlier, like I work with Whose Knowledge as a co-lead of Liberatory Archives and Memory. Liberatory archives and like a liberatory approach to memory that basically is a sort of a practice to challenge institutional power on what is valuable as knowledge, and to like reach some sort of epistemological justice, given the fact is that like we live in a world of multiple systems of operations. Community archives, as an example, it means that like we work with people who produce their own knowledges in an archival way. They are preserving their own histories, even if this is outside of institutional archives. And also why archives? Archives basically can be like a medium that shifts those narratives in all aspects of the glam world, like in galleries, in libraries, and in museums as well. A little bit about the initiative itself. Liberatory archives and memory program is basically bases itself on the capacity of what archives can do in relation to disrupting systems of power and reaching epistemological justice for the forcibly marginalized. And here I want you to think about how archives, in a way or another, as a medium, it is defined in a certain colonial aspects, in a certain Western rigid approaches. And this critique of Western approach to archives is based on also in what it has been doing to history, what it has been doing to what we have been studying in history books, what we have been seeing in museums. And in relation to that, you need to think of every step of the archival process on how, for example, an artifact is being labeled, of how an artifact is being categorized, specifically when it comes from an indigenous culture. And that also can give you the connection that you need in relation to archives, to the examples I have listed from testimonies of people visiting the Met museums. In our own laboratory practices to archives, we have a specific vision on how we want to work with that. And we're doing this through building a digital map for community archives. That means that the program as an initiative in itself is a global effort to map people who are archiving their own histories and their own communities on very, very different themes, multiple languages, multiple formats as well, digital and non-digital. And we are building this digital map for community archives so it can be hopefully accessible to more people, and it can also serve as a home for community archives. And this point is specifically important because when you're not affiliated with an institution and when you're working individually or independently, you're always compromised for your link to be broken, for you have always a sustainability issue, specifically if the people who are doing the work are no longer around for all different reasons. The second point that we are also working on is basically on challenging and dismantling the oppressive Western archival series. And basically, as I have mentioned, we work with what has been defined about archives in academia, and we are doing our best to challenge it, specifically to eliminate oppressive languages and oppressive narratives around certain communities and also specific heritages. Not doing all of that, we cannot do it without having conversations with community archivists and historians and cultural workers and artists working with archives. So that means that doing this work, it requires a lot of envisioning. And this is why for you doing this certificate is quite important. So you start in a way learning the basics and approaches and understanding how do you take it a bit far to challenge systems of power while thinking of access. And Creative Commons, as a foundation, have been doing this for ages, and it has built a discourse along many others for us all to challenge what access can be and what it can look like. And it is a learning process for all of us. And finally, we cannot do all of this without imagining what a just archive can look like. And what I mean here, but by a just archive, is basically archives based on social justice, archives based on aligned representations of how people want to be presented and represented, of how history wants to like be remembered and preserved without leaving certain aspects of the story left or erased. And that's for today. I will leave the space now for all of you if you have any questions, and for us also to discuss certain aspects on nuanced approaches for archives. Thank
Thanks
you
so
very
much,
much.
Sharon. Feel free to raise your hands or just kind of jump in with questions. If you would rather type them out in the chat, that works too. I'm happy to help read them out if you prefer not to speak out loud.
Yeah, I'm reading one of the responses of, I remember the dancing and the prayer case, such an interesting case of museums, policing versus cultural expression. For me, like reading this, like it was very, very interesting as well. Because I feel like there is some sort of a subtle discomfort that feels like a constant aggression at certain, for some people at museums, in relation to cultural expression. And I have been really enjoying all efforts that are being exerted to address this as like in a way a responsibility of heritage sites to actually do better around cultural expression.
Was there an entry point, Sally? We were chatting a little bit before we got started about museums, and I'm wondering if there was an entry point in your own experiences where you realized this was something that you were really passionate about changing.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, my entry point into like thinking of memory work and heritage sites, it has been a constant journey of like getting here, specifically when you think of knowledge. Most of my life, I have done a lot of knowledge production outside of institutes. And at the moment where you stop doing this work, this is when you start worrying about what would happen to this produced knowledge if it's not basically getting preserved. And specifically because, like, most of the time there is a problem of resources. So the knowledge always like mostly end up getting lost, and then the history gets lost. And here I mean the history of, it can be about a certain movement, it can be about like a certain local community in your country, or like your neighborhood story. And it's basically like in a way that leads you to ask always the questions about how intimate memory is, and how basically collective memories that are produced by the state, that are produced by the institute, not necessarily very aligned to people as experiences. And I think that was for me an entry point to think about archives, and that's what actually has gotten me to learn archiving and to think about archiving, to know that it is a much bigger effort than only myself. It has happening worldwide, and I'm sure like a lot of us, we see, for example, on social media, how every now and then there is like an archive of this or that, a new map that is trying to reimagine history, and that is trying to reimagine how stories have been captured. And I think for me, this kind of work is quite precious. And to connect this a bit with accessibility, I think as like instinct for me, like it was always like any work that I do, it was licensed with Creative Commons, and that was like never a question for me that I want my work to be under copyrights versus like to be accessible. And I think in a way, this kind of work around accessibility, it has given me also the opportunity to learn a lot outside of institutes and to want to think about copyrights in more nuanced and critical ways.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question, which is in our coursework, we've come across the utilitarian theory of copyright. Is there a philosophical or political theory that your work in archiving is grounded on?
100%, of course. So like this kind of work is definitely based on multiple efforts on radical justice and like radical justice as like it has been growing from multiple movements in academia to challenge like certain aspects of how, for example, like in race studies and gender studies and also like an based on epistemological justice approach and meaning here like about on epistemological justice on how you produce knowledge that is representative and accessible is not representative. Accessible is not only a solution to reach this epistemological justice, it is a step towards like liberation. But with accessibility, if it's not based on actual people realities, and it's not if it's not defined by those who are in a way or another like come from very specific, very private, very honored indigenous culture, it can end up being inappropriate in a lot of ways. It can cause harm to the communities. And I'm happy to also like refer some readings after like the webinar today, but also I'm sure that Creative Commons have amazing resources on that.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? So
I do
Anna,
have,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, no, I was thinking that I have a question for the room. Is there any case, if any of you has seen cases that it wouldn't be appropriate for this like case or story to be digitized, meaning that in relation to what is important for us to recognize when a cultural case shouldn't be open at all. It can be anything or also like a question to think about if you're sitting with any questions or even thoughts around that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm not sure if this fully answers your question, but the thing that comes to mind is our collection has been here for many years, and as we know, language kind of evolves and changes. So some of the language that was used in the archives when they were first kind of identifying, and especially with our LGBTQIA collection, what they were using in the beginning is not something that we deem appropriate now. And so we've gone through and tried to what is the term? but we're redefining it using language that the community has deemed appropriate. There's a document that I forget now, but it's basically terms that the LGBTQIA community would like to be referred to when they are like using archival records for that. So I think it's good to look for those resources. I know look for the resources if they exist, helps with collections that you might not have the, yeah, sorry. Great.
That's
Thanks,
great.
Taylor.
Yeah, that reminds me of we hosted another webinar as part of the Open Culture program here at Creative Commons about respectful terminologies. I'm going to find that for you and drop it in the chat, because there are a lot of different approaches to how that challenge presents in different contexts. Yeah, Jean, go ahead.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is fully, the intended answer, but certainly what came to mind when this question was asked. I know for some Indigenous communities, it's banned to, record ceremonies or take photos outside for outsiders to do that, because they want to preserve the traditions purely within their communities, and they want to preserve the tradition of oral history and history as something that gets passed down communally rather than recorded, and as we prefer and we like to think about history as something which should be recorded and should be in a way trapped within like the walls of a museum or trapped within the pages of a book. And I think this brings up sort of like an interesting kind of conundrum within libraries and archives and museums, which is that, if what we're doing is against the wishes of the people, then is what we're doing good? And is what we're doing, does it serve, like we say it serves humanity, but does it really just serve our own need to be the recorders of knowledge and to be the holders of knowledge? And so that's kind of what came to mind as the question was asked and as this presentation was unfolding. Excellent, excellent presentation, by the way.
Thank you so much. I really like what you said about the holders of knowledge. I do think this is truly like one of the biggest problems that we are like facing and have been constantly facing, and specifically this space in relation to Creative Commons and in relation to the open culture movement. It has been a response to actually challenge that there is one holder of knowledge. And also in our work on laboratory archives, it is also based on that history actually can have multiple variations, and it is only natural and normal to tell it from different aspects and perspectives. Thank you so much for your comments. I see another comment slash question from Anne. Anne, would you like to come in by voice?
Sure. Sorry, trying to get my video on here. So I worked for many years with Indigenous nations and First Nations in Maine, which is where I work now as a librarian. And I have, since I did my graduate work, I've had issues with archives and museums and the way that things are categorized, as you were saying, and also displayed in some of the contextual ways that we try to make sense, whether we're teaching or exhibiting things. When I visited the National Museum of the American Indian, which I know that name is problematic, but I was really struck that it's not everything is historically arranged. They really try to get away from those historicizing tropes and talk about a more Indigenous idea of past, present, and future, and not always use this teleological arrangement. And then maps, one of the first encounters I had in the field with a native point of view was somebody had a map of Wabanaki territories in Maine, and an Abenaki elder flipped it upside down and said, "This is how we view it. It flows down to the St. Lawrence River. It's not, it's on the bottom, it's not on the top." And I was like, oh my gosh, wow. Mind bomb, right? And then like right now in my office, I have a Penobscot Nation map of Maine that has indigenous territory names for different places, but there's some that they say we have left off a number of sites because it's not appropriate for outsiders to know about this. This is traditional knowledge that is for us alone. And I like that a lot.
I love the stories of really like intimate witnessing of like being like while doing the work. Thank you so much for sharing this story, and
I guess I never thought about it in terms of some of the broader terms that you were using today, the epistemological concerns. But yeah, so thank you for adding that layer to that,
of course,
as you said, very personal experience.
I'm very happy that like it's resonating with you and your own work, and yeah, happy to hear more from the room as well. Any more stories or questions? I will leave in the chat a few questions that I have from the presentation, maybe to inspire the room. Can really like be a conversation even if we do not have very concrete thoughts around access. Mhm. 100%, and has written in the chat regarding accessibility. Many clams are in urban areas and far removed from the people whose cultures are represented in them. From Jean as well, so many museums have vast warehouses of work that they do not have space to exhibit, then it is essentially lost to the viewer. Yeah, I have always found this to be quite unsettling for like history to basically be stored in like storage rooms, and mostly actually like in a lot of cases it is work that has been removed from its reality, and also basically like anyways, there is a denial of access, but also it is a denial of access to the most privileged if you get to be at those museums.
I did want to add on to Jean's point. There was a documentary I watched about a group of Inuit people from the southern part of Canada trying to find ways to get their cultural material back and like different repatriation. When she mentioned that like not having access, there was the idea in their culture that the cultural items created for religious purposes have lives and are respected in the way that they are living in a sense. And that being in museums or archives is this weird dead space where they weren't laid to rest properly. And the like hurt of the culture, just seeing it and just watching like fully grown men cry was just like hard to watch. But it brings that conversation to us that it wasn't really, they don't, we don't understand how these items are meant to be treated. Yeah, just wanted to comment.
Thank you, Taylor. Would you link us with the documentary or just like write the title in the chat? Sounds incredible. There's also like one comment in relation to archives. There are limitations to visit some areas. There are collections which they cannot allow you for access easily, especially in national archives. We think that this could be an issue for future generations if we cannot be able to preserve those collections on the internet. If yes, what do you suggest to maintain them for many years? To be honest, I think in a lot of contexts, like archives are actually inherently inaccessible places, specifically national archives. So the issue of accessibility in certain archives when it comes to national archives, it is, I think, like there is a space of like when to push the boundaries of what is accessible and what isn't. But about the point of digitization, I don't think digitization is the solution. I think digitization is one step, but also that doesn't necessarily respond to the question of which stories and which archives, specifically when it comes to certain communities. And specifically also, like, one day I hope that everything can be accessible for all of us, but it is the work of all of you, like in the GLAM world, where like you are also on daily basis, like responsible on making decisions or inspiring certain decisions to be made. So I also think of our individual capacities to challenge those systems on a daily basis of what can be accessible, specifically when we think of access and in the way that we have been discussing today. And if digitalization is not the only answer to liberating knowledge, big part of what I do is to imagine like solutions around that, and to hopefully like challenge institutes to also like in a way or another not only create accessibility but also actually challenge the systems of power within how knowledge is being produced and how knowledge is being shared and remembered. No worries, Taylor. Anytime. Jean?
Yeah, I have another thought to contribute. So I think a lot about the Louvre, maybe too much, more than I should. But in a book chapter that I co-authored with some other folks about anti-Blackness in museums, I spoke in about the problem the Louvre has in relationship to Blackness, because the Louvre, if you go on their website now, you'll see like, you know, they have like a promotion for like you know, they have, I think on their website right now they have like a black breakdancer like breakdancing in the Louvre, and you know they have like they have a link to like Beyonce's music video that Sheena Carter's did in the Louvre. But if you actually look at the interactive museum map for the Louvre, the the African art section, which is also kind of squeezed together with like art of Africa, art of Oceania, arts of Asia. It's not available to view digitally on the museum interactive map, or at least it wasn't at the time I did the research. And, you know, I just find this to be a very uncomfortable dichotomy for the Louvre to have, in which we have all this essentially lost knowledge that has been often acquired through very unethical means. And when we digitize things, we often neglect it. And then it has this effect of where we are prioritizing more white facing art, while still pretending, unfortunately, that we, you know, care about this art that we're not taking care of and we're not properly stewarding. And I honestly believe if we don't properly steward this art, we should return it. But, you know, that's me. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. I love how you framed it. I find myself thinking a lot about the Louvre. I have those moments too, like thinking about museums and being haunted sometimes by the myth. But to your point, earlier today I was reading this piece by African Digital Heritage, and they specifically actually work and discuss your point. And basically, it is on the case for open restitution to African heritage data. I hope it gives you an answer, like they frame it as an Africa-centered approach to restitution data.
All right. Any last questions? May let it end early. This was a really rich presentation, Sally. Thanks so much for all of your thoughts and sharing all of this information.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye bye.
Bye.